LLM at SOAS in London. And he will be talking, as you can see there, about redefining norms in parallel. And without further ado, Ankit, the floor is yours. Hopefully, all technical things work out well.
Well, I'm sure they will. Let me begin by thanking the organizers, especially Barry, for allowing me to speak virtually, and also for the fantastic initiative that he and his colleagues have created. This paper is as you see on your slides, offering a sort of an overview of the multi-layered system that the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention cover. The introductory part is, of course, quite explanatory, so I shan't invest too much time on it, only to share that this paper employs bifurcated analytical approach, and in doing so, it investigates both the multinormativity and also the multi-level functionality of the CBW regime. And in doing so, it discusses the international law scholarships that plays a role in identifying the hard law and the soft law while scrutinizing the combined effectiveness and efficacy of the regime and also the threats that it faces. Simultaneously, it also explores the multi-level functionality of the CBW regime, but also draws upon the regulatory theory addressing the dynamic interplay between these. This comprehensive exploration intends to identify the potential synergies and also the opportunities for improvement of both macro and micro perspectives. In addressing these aspects, this study aligns with the Secretary General's mechanisms for investigation of alleged use of chemical weapons and biological weapons, which emphasizes the significance of international cooperation and compliance with these regimes. As I started off, the historical significance, at least for this audience, is not very important, so I shan't invest too much time on it, only to suggest and underscore the importance of these laws which came into fruition in 1915 of April, wherein the Europe's in Belgium were first affected by chlorine gases and the pressurized cylinders which were responsible for this in Germany. It also brought to light the 1899 Hague Convention Conference Declaration, which was the first international attempt to limit chemical agents in warfare and ban them as quote unquote use of projectiles designed to diffuse poisonous gases. Later on, of course, this gathers further traction. However, unfortunately, countries such as those in the P5, but also others, have used these chemical weapons without any sort of persecution or attack. And as this paper will later suggest, three relevant and also current examples where we see this in much more detail. It is also, to some extent, most important to remember and highlight the United States' use of chemical weapons and the attacks against Iran, against the emboldened Saddam Hussein, and in response the Middle East, particularly, especially Syria, and the accelerated use of chemical weapons since then. Syria is also an important part of this paper and shall be discussed later. As you see on your screens, you'll see the historical dynamics and creation of these conventions as means of protection, and as will be later reflected in the conclusion, are a lasting thought and a memory to preserve this ambition. To the more meaty parts of this essay seeks to discuss and represent the critical components of the international legal architecture aimed to eliminate the threat posed by chemical and biological weapons and to reduce the chemical weapons stockpiles available. And in thinking about this, one is compelled to imagine a treaty that addresses, say for instance, the American, Russian, or the Soviet stockpiles of nerve agents, mustard gas, blister missiles, and agents, and also the first steps towards a comprehensive treaty. Even if one imagines a comprehensive treaty, does it have to be in the form of a global treaty? And certain chemical agents and stockpiles that can be used for weapons, and the comprehensive ban of those weapons. And how does one go about this? We've also heard in the recent history about Novichok's and the production program of the traditional chemical weapons and warfare as agents, especially under Gorbachev. Russians began to recognize and accept the need for mandatory on-site inspection as a part of global weapons and the regime. specifically regards to the Chemical Weapons Convention, which aims to eradicate these weapons, their production, and the stockpiles, to undertake stockpile productions facilities and refrain from assisting in prohibition of other areas. There is a specific schedule, as is highlighted in the relevant action section of the law, uh, which imposes the strictest controls to the direct application of these weapons in these production areas. You also see the verification mechanisms in place and the regime that is used to manage prohibition of these weapons. And then you look at the compliance mechanisms, which also look at the UN Security Council for some sort of reference. You can also study this with the Biological Weapons Convention and the prohibition of the development, production, and possession of these weapons and toxins, specifically for hostile purposes as well. Prohibitions, again, for this respect, are banning the use of weapons and also the verification, which leads to the lack of these confidence building measures and sharing of declarations and voluntary visits to such sites. Of course, when one compares and contrasts this, you see the challenge in overseeing a biological weapon to the dual nature and the technical expertise that are required in this aspect. The multinormativity of these regimes is also important, as is highlighted in the hard laws of this aspect, which is the disarmament of this architecture and the embodiment of binding commitments towards international law, and also the enforcement of these mechanisms. This also requires a rigorous mechanism for further study and also for further importance. There are other aspects such as the soft law regimes, which help in non-binding principles, guidelines, declarations, state behavior. But you can also look at the Australia Group as an example, where an international or an informal forum of countries that seek to ensure an export contributes to the development of chemical weapons is further curtailed. You also see UN General Assembly resolutions, but the hard play between these aspects is three-pronged, namely complementarity, flexibility and adaptation, and potential tensions which can be explored. But to at least conclude this part, it is also important to reflect that the multinormativity concept is richly manifested in the CBW prohibition regimes and the interplay between hard and soft laws, which provides a nuanced and multi-layered approach reflecting the complexity and regulating chemical and biological weapons on a global scale. These regimes and the ability to navigate between the rigidity of hard laws and flexibility underscores the potential challenges and further development. The multi-level functionality of these regimes is also characterized and interconnected with the existence of a comprehensive structure that aims to harmonize the effects and prevent development and production of these levels. You see these at different levels, which are highlighted with the screens. Of course, interstate cooperation is within international organizations, but you also see this in national levels such as the US Chemical and Biological Weapons Control and Welfare Elimination Act of 1991. There are, of course, challenges that this faces as well, but you also see this in the sub-level regimes, wherein compliance mechanisms with the biotechnological sectors is also involved, thus involving itself in a private international law regime as well. But the interactions and synergies further require harmonization and coordination, monitoring and also enforcement, and an adaptation based on flexibility. Within all these regimes, you see a comprehensive approach to complex understanding, but also an integration of international, national, and sub-regional efforts. These lessons from the CBW regimes can be offered as valued areas of international governance, reflecting an intricate balance between managing global issues through multi-level frameworks. I've of course elaborated on these issues, but I shan't spend too much time on those and look at the first case study in this aspect, which is of Syria, and of course the attacks that took place in 2013, but also in 2012, wherein these attacks gained massive traction. You have the UNOPCW, which is a joint investigative mechanism regime established to identify perpetrators and was committed using these weapons by the Syrian government. The Security Council was of course divided in its vote, and the threat posed by Moscow and Washington to compel Assad to join CWC in 2013 and declare the stockpile weapons and agree to eliminate it as soon as possible. The destruction processes were carried out through a remarkable operation on board the US merchant marine ship Cape Ray, and in 4 continents, namely Finland, Germany, United Kingdom, and the United States. It was announced that an entirely Syria's stockpile of 1,308 metric tons of sulfur mustard gas had been destroyed in January 2016. Moving on to Europe, what this reflects, at least before we sort of jump into this, is the limitations of the framework, but also the challenges and the attributes and the enforcement of collective efforts working together. The Salisbury incident is something which took place perhaps not so far from where I am here in London. This was an international incident, and coordinated efforts and responses were required to underscore the importance of solidarity and the role that was to be played by the organization. Last but perhaps most importantly is the most live situation that we deal with. The situation of Ukraine demonstrates the need for proactive measures and the importance of international monitoring to prevent potential efforts. This, of course, goes much beyond just the conventional threats of nuclear challenge as well that we have to deal with. Moving swiftly to the challenges and opportunities. Challenges, of course, seen in these slides, emphasizes the global ban and the successful destruction work which is ongoing in the use of chemical weapons by states, but some terror organizations as well. In Egypt, Israel, North Korea, South Sudan need to join the convention for it to become much more powerful and also useful. You also see these efforts of ratification mechanisms and has been characterized and also criticized for the lack of effectiveness and transparency that it offers. More than half of all the members of the OPCW inspectors are still related to disarmament, limiting the ability for the organization to detect and deter proliferation. You also see this in respect to political divisions within the organization. Technological advancements can also make a massive difference. Institutional challenges, especially closing the loophole of the Riot Control Agents, Article 29D of the Chemical Weapons Convention designates law enforcement, including domestic riot control, as a potential acceptable purpose for this use of toxic chemical weapons. There are also opportunities for enhanced compliance and enforcement, especially in the case of Syria, as we saw earlier. The joint investigative mechanism which was set up, but also determined by the use of chemical weapons that were used by Syria and the Islamic State, by Russia as well, and blocked its renewal by the United Nations Security Council last year. A special office for attribution will also consist of joint heads of investigation, which can perhaps be used to improve the verification mechanisms, build consensus between states, adapt to technological challenges as suggested earlier, strengthen the institutions, engage with civil sector and civil society cooperation as well. And all in all, this sort of suggests that the cornerstone of international disarmament and the security architecture confronts numerous challenges that underscore the need for a multifaceted strategy for enforcement. A combination of top-down reform of international law and governance coupled with a bottom-up engagement of regional cooperation may pave the way for a more robust and resilient framework. The urgency of this matter cannot be overstated enough, and the grave consequences of CBW proliferation for national peace and security are of much more importance. By delving into the historical context of the normative framework, multinormativity, multi-level functionality, case studies such as those which I have highlighted above offer regimes and also opportunities for improvement. And as this analysis has shared a comprehensive picture of the CBW prohibition regimes and the myriad of challenges ranging from compliance and enforcement to technological advancements, indicates the use and the existing frameworks through the groundbreaking work and inception which now require urgent fortification. This relevance is also deployment of chemical weapons in Syria and Europe, coupled with potential threats emanating from Ukrainian conflict, underscores the real and present dangers. Opportunities for improvement are also identified, suggesting the necessity of a multifaceted approach, which includes enhancing compliance and also enforcement mechanisms, improving the verification procedures, and also adapting technological challenges and regional cooperation as well. Ultimately, the regimes of the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention remain an indispensable instrument in the quest for global, safer environment, not just for us, but also for the future generations. And that, of course, is a thought that transcends from this regime of law to environmental regime of intergenerational equity and also protection of the environment. And with the thought of cross-connection, cross-section, I end with these concluding thoughts, which are of course not my words, but are words which are etched in history. And I quote the following: chemical weapons do not belong to the belong to the back pages of history, but not to the front pages of our newspapers. So I have once again thanked the organizers for giving me an opportunity to share my thoughts and perspectives. I am truly grateful and honored to them for giving me the obligation to share my thoughts. Thank you.